The Beatles album Abbey Road concluded the band's body of work in glorious style, with an amazing group of timeless songs and also a sound that was emerging out of the 60s with advancing technology and brand new instruments like the Moog synthesizer. This is the story of its recording and how they took advantage of all this to create a fantastic sounding classic album. Coming off the back of the Let It Be project, where they ventured out of their comfort zone and found it to be extremely challenging up to the point of a near split, the band were keen to return to their tried and tested surrounding and studio personnel. Incredibly, only 3 weeks had passed before they reconvened for the last Let It Be session, and rather ironically, not at Abbey Road. They actually kicked off at Trident Studios recording backing tracks for I Want You She's So Heavy, with Billy Preston on Hammond organ, and only recorded sporadically until the 2nd of July due to Ringo's commitment to the film The Magic Christian, and John and Yoko's car accident, which Yoko hadn't fully recovered from when they got back together. This resulted in John installing a bed into Abbey Road so she could continue being permanently by his side. When recording finally got underway at Abbey Road, it was on their newly installed TG12345 desk, specifically designed to serve the expanded recording format of 8 tracks. Doing away with the tubes, the new desk was entirely transistor based, which meant less inherent distortion, better low-end clarity, but with somewhat softer, more delicate sound. Engineer Jeff Emmerich recalls the first few days. I had trouble getting the same kind of sounds they were used to. There were a lot of long faces for the first few days, but there's no way the old mixing console could be brought in, so we went along with it. There was actually a bit of a fight between the engineers to use the new console, and they did actually end up using the old red console for I Want You She's So Heavy, which gives it that more aggressive tube crunch. The new desk also had more onboard options to affect the sound. There was both EQ and dynamic control, with a choice of compression and full limiting. Previously, they had to use outboard gear when using the red desk to get this functionality, and only when mixing down or bouncing. You can really hear the channel compression at work on John's acoustic guitar for Polythene Pam. Waves have a plugin emulating this desk, so you can use it in your own recordings. I haven't used it much myself, but I want to have a listen to see what it can do. Having 8 tracks meant they didn't really have to rely on tape reductions as much, if at all in some cases, meaning that the fidelity was enhanced, as was the increased possibilities of instrument placement in the mix. It even allowed Emmerich to record Ringo's drums in stereo for quite a few tracks, which gave added depth to the overall sound. Amazingly though, none of the orchestral recordings were in stereo on the album, and occupied just one single mono track, which is amazing considering how good it sounds on tracks like Something and The End. One of the biggest innovations on the album was their use of a synthesizer for the first time. It was George Harrison that introduced the synthesizer to the Beatles' sonic palette, namely a custom-made Moog 3. He first encountered a Moog synthesizer in November '68 while in Los Angeles. He was working on a production of Jackie Lomax's album for the Apple label. On the final day of recording, Bernie Krause, acting as sales representative for Moog, introduced a new massive electronic instrument called the Moog Modular 3. During the session, Krause was overdubbing unusual sounds while tinkering with this electronic instrument. George Harrison, always eager to explore new sonic possibilities, was captivated by the sounds. He asked Krause to stay after the session and demonstrate the instrument to him. Harrison also instructed the sound engineer to keep recording, a detail Krause was unaware of. Fragments from that recording eventually made their way onto the track No Time or Space from Harrison's early 1969 album, Electronic Sounds, released on the Zapple label. George then brought the Moog to Abbey Road, and the rest of the Beatles were just as intrigued as he was, and it found its way onto many tracks. Emmerich recalls, "We used it for the first time in Because to create that French horn sound, which is absolutely amazing for that time. McCartney used it for the solo on Maxwell's Silver Hammer, to wonderful effect on the transitions in Here Comes the Sun, and complementing McCartney's bass guitar in Me Mr. Mustard. Additionally, it provided a wave-like sound comprised of white noise and I Want You She's So Heavy." The Moog synthesizer represented a significant technological innovation on Abbey Road, and they even processed vocals through it. During the solo for Octopus's Garden, they can be heard singing as if they're underwater. The bubbling effect on the vocals was created by running the track through a compressor, triggered by a pulsing signal from the Moog's low-frequency oscillator. It made a wobbling, gargling sort of sound that was perfect for what we wanted to achieve, Emmerich said. Although they had been very synonymous with Vox amps over the years, by this stage they were almost exclusively playing through Fender amps, including the Twin Reverb, Showman, Bassman and Deluxe Reverb. The only real exception to this was George's use of his Leslie amp and cabinet, which he'd been using for a few years at this point. The Bassman was not only being used for Paul's bass, John also quite often favoured this amp for his guitar. With the lack of any real gap between the recording of Let It Be and Abbey Road, the guitar lineup was pretty much identical, with George bringing his prototype Rosewood Telecaster he famously used for the rooftop gig. His 57 Les Paul, that all now red, started life as a gold top and in the possession of Eric Clapton, who gifted it to George the year before. George also had an Epiphone Casino, as did Paul and John, who played them pretty much exclusively. For acoustic guitars, George had his Gibson J200 and Paul and John had their Martin D28s that they purchased prior to their visit to India. Paul still had his iconic 63 Hofner bass alongside his Rickenbacker 4001S and Fender Jazz. This was favoured by George when on bass duties along with a Fender 6, which was used a lot on the Let It Be sessions. This unusual 6-string bass seems to be the bass of choice for John and George when Paul was on piano. Paul's strings with the very distinctive Roto Sound black nylon flat wounds by this stage seems to be all his basses, not just his Hofner, as you can see here on the rooftop concert. These strings gave a warm, mellow sound that were akin to a double bass, and they certainly sound great on the opening track Come Together. The track came about by Timothy Leary asking John to write him a campaign song, as the phrase Come Together was the main part of his campaign slogan. It was going to be shelved until Paul suggested they rework it, slowing it down and giving it a swampy feel, aided by his iconic bass line, smooth Rhodes work and Ringo's fantastic drumming. Ringo's choice of drums for the album were the same kit he used for Let It Be, purchased in 1968 to replace his Ludwig Black Oyster. The Ludwig Hollywood is played exclusively, although he did keep his 63 Jazz Festival snare that he played throughout his Beatles career. It's notable that this kit is a 5-piece with 3 toms instead of 2. Ringo did say he got a bit tom heavy on this album. I think it's a great effect, and I'm glad he did. From the solo on the medley to the amazing rolls on Come Together, you couldn't possibly imagine those songs played any other way now. Ringo had been using tea towels to dampen the ring of his kit for some time by this point. It helped to create a more defined sound that was very much in fashion at this point in time. Although with the use of the Fairchild and the RS-124 compressor they had at Abbey Road, even when Ringo used tea towels, it was possible to bring up any remaining ring. This was a great effect as the kit sounded defined and huge at the same time. I wanted to try this out in my studio, as I really do love the sound of the drums on this album. Emmerich recalls Ringo's tom fills really added a lot to Here Comes the Sun, but funnily enough he hated doing them because he could never remember what he did from one take to the next. I think that's why his fills are so spectacular. He felt that he would never reproduce them, so he'd better get them right. Of course, the song The End would have been a very fitting way to sign off, as it was originally intended. But an editing accident changed all that. The song Her Majesty was supposed to sit in the middle of the medley. Paul didn't like it in there, and asked the engineer John Kurlander to remove it. Of course, in those days, that meant literally cutting and splicing the tape. But instead of destroying it, the engineer spliced it onto the end of the master tape, just in case. Forgetting about this, the tape was then sent for a test pressing, and the snippet of Her Majesty was still on there 14 seconds after the last track. Paul loved this unexpected accident, so they decided to keep it. And with that, the album was finished. In a way, it's a huge shame that we didn't get to see the band continue to benefit from ever-developing studio technology. But the way in which they signed off is so poetically perfect, and with the climate of the band the way it was evident they could no longer go on. So we should be thankful at least that we got to see the band evolve and get to use these new studio toys and expand their creativity far beyond anyone could have imagined when they first stepped into Abbey Road in 1963.